This is where I expose my iTunes library, and you can see that S Club 7 are in here as well. All sorts of dodgy things. It works. Morning. Is everybody well caffeinated this morning? I need to be. It's a big group. How many have we got? A rough guess. 8. 8 is good. That makes 9. So, good morning. Thank you very, very much for coming. My name's Andy Clark, and I just want to have a bit of fun today, I think. We're going to talk about some cool stuff. And sorry, what was that sound? I don't recognise those chimes. It's like a relic of the past. We're going to have some fun today. We're going to talk about CSS, but we're not just going to talk about CSS. We're going to look, I think, at some of the other interesting things that are going on. And really, the object of the day is to have a bit of fun, but also to kind of see whether there's directions that we can push CSS in, rather than just kind of sit back on our laurels and do the same kind of stuff that we've always done. So, is everybody comfortable? Does everybody need anything? You can all hear me okay? Cool. Well, that's me looking far cooler than I ought to, thanks to Patrick Lauker. Just a quick show of hands. How many people in the room are designers? Oh, quite a lot, actually. And how many people work with code but wouldn't consider themselves to be kind of visually aware? Right, okay. So, more designers than non-designers, which is quite good.
What about people with code and are aware?
So, well, oh yes, what about people that design and code? Ooh, blimey. So did you put your hands up the first 2 times, or? I'm very confused. Maths wasn't my strong point at school, ever. Well, that's good, because this is not going to be a technical presentation at all. There's going to be some code. I'd encourage you not to write anything down. All the slides that I'm going to go through are up online. Hello? I have this remote-y thing that doesn't ever work. All the slides are up online at that URL, which will be at the end of the thing as well. I'd encourage everybody not to hit my server. Please don't dig the URL or anything like that, because it's a 20 megabyte PDF. So Media Temple will give me hosting, but there are limits. So that's me smoking, which is my second favourite pastime. And there's the obligatory shameless plug for a book that I did write last year, which is available from all good bookstores. None of which is actually going to be covered in the talk today. I wanted to spend a little time. One of the problems I find as a kind of a working designery kind of guy is that you never get any time to play. I mean, particularly because I work for myself, it's like you move from one job to the next, one client project. And I usually try to schedule about 2 or 3 days between the end of one job and the start of the other. And it never works out. The jobs, they always end up bloody overlapping. So I never ever get any time to kind of play. So I actually spent my holiday in France doing this workshop and coming up with new designs and some hopefully fun and interesting things, which we're going to do. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about is echoed in the book, but it's not if you've got the book already. Thank you very much. If you haven't, it's available from all good bookstores. And I didn't want to just kind of regurgitate the stuff that was in the book, so we've got some new things as well. So, let's just do another quick show of hands for those people that do design and code, and or just code. In terms of kind of CSS knowledge, if you were to rate yourself between 1 and 5, so 1 being what does CSS stand for, and 5 being you could write more CSS on Eric Meyer. Where are we? How many 1s have we got? Absolute beginners. Oh, that's good. The marketing actually did work. 2s. Oh, God, here we go. 3s. 4s. Any 5s? Gary? Right, so Gary, you're going to come and... I'm going to sit down here. Mr. Barber's going to do the presentation for the rest of the day. Kind of no format, especially no kind of Q&A sessions or slots. We're going to have half an hour breaks every 1.5 hours, which, if you smoke a lot like me, is a blessing. I don't know, I haven't done this presentation before, end to end, so we might have too little content, we might have far too much content. I think we'll just see how it goes. And if anybody's got any questions or things they want to throw down here, then that would be cool as well. So, should we kick off? Should we do some stuff? Anybody got any questions at this point? Good. So, I love showing this slide. Who remembers this? Anybody remember this? From the dawn of time. This was Erik Costello doing his box lessons. And I think this was about 97, 98, something like that. It was a long, long time ago. And this was one of the first kind of sites where Erik had published various CSS layouts, kind of common layouts, 1, 2, 3 columns, etc. And actually where you could go up onto the site and steal the code and repurpose it and do your own stuff, which was, I think, one of the first times that we'd seen people really doing this and sharing this kind of stuff online, much from a designer's point of view. So, anybody remember this? Yeah, this is Blue Robot's layout reservoir. I always ask this question. Can anybody remember the name of the guy that did the Blue Robot? There's only one person in the world I know that actually remembers who that was. It was a guy called Rob Chandonais, who actually is blogging again at the Blue Robot. But again, this was one of those sites where the layouts were published and you could go online and just download them and repurpose them. And it was very, very interesting. When I started to look back on these early CSS layouts, because this was a real starting point for designers being able to maybe easily go and dissect CSS layouts and repurpose them for the way that they wanted to work. Interestingly, from a historical point of view, both of these sites were using absolute positioning to create layouts. And I think a lot of the time we've gone away from that. We've had a tendency over the last few years to use floats for various reasons. And actually, I think absolute positioning is back, particularly now as we can understand a little bit more about how to make it work better inside flexible layouts or with variable font sizes. We can do a lot more with positioning now that we've got a lot more understanding of it. And also there's other factors that help us use positioning a lot better than we used to. Lots of JavaScript supported solutions that are going to help us to make layouts with positioning. So I'm a big fan of positioning techniques, and if you haven't done much positioning, if you've used floats for layout for the majority of the time, then we're going to do a lot of positioning trickery today, because it's one of my... Are you all right there? Would you like a glass of water or something? I've got some water here. Do you like some water? Seriously? Well, I don't want anybody dying in the front row. That would just be rude. Have some. If you need some water, have some water. I'm just going to drink caffeine all day. So yeah, we're going to do a lot of kind of positioning trickery and a lot of interesting ways that we can essentially turn very little in terms of markup into hopefully things that are visually very stimulating. So we've come a hell of a long way, I think, from those kind of early CSS layouts. And obviously there's been a whole variety of sites that have been very influential along the way. I mean, we've had Dan Cederholm's doing Fast Company and Doug Bowman's Wired redesign, and I'm sure everybody's seen all of those kind of things. And certainly when it comes to things like the Zen Garden, then I don't think there's any doubt anymore that we can do really engaging and stimulating visual layouts with CSS. Which, there was a time when people thought that CSS layouts were boxy and boring, and Jesus Christ, they were. I mean, that was when there were really, the early CSS layouts were being done by people, like Eric Meyer, who's going to freely admit that he's not a designer, so he thinks that just putting a grey border around something looks really cool. Now, of course, there's a hell of a lot more CSS stuff going on, and I don't know whether or not we can look at any kind of percentages, but certainly the vast majority of the stuff that I tend to look at has CSS powering the back end for the most part. I mean, this is just a sample. Please, this is the only time you're going to see this transition. I thought it was cool at the time. I mean, it's just some amazingly varied stuff. I mean, I get very bored with web design a lot of the time, and I get very bored with looking at CSS galleries and seeing the same kind of things, this awful kind of Web 2.0-y, glossy, roundy, greeny, bluey thing cropping up all the time. So I just picked half a dozen sites that I'd found recently that had a little bit of personality, but also were using good typography, nice use of colour, and just some very varied stuff. I'm sure a lot of people, if you follow what goes on blogs and galleries and things, you'll have seen this kind of thing before. But I think really the most important point now is that we needn't think that the technologies that we're using, particularly markup and CSS, need to limit the visual creativity that we want to achieve. And that's always been very much a topic of conversation, hasn't it, over the last few years. It's like, well, I'd really like to do this, but I can't do it because there's no browser support, or there's poor browser support in X browser. Whereas I think really if we try to take a little bit of a quantum leap, we realise that actually there are ways that we can generally achieve anything that we want to achieve, even with the fairly limited powers of the technologies that we've got available right now in terms of markup and CSS. So this is actually one of my real favourites at the moment. This is Ryan Carson, the web megalomaniac, is running a kind of a road trip around Europe, meeting his people. And Elliot J. Stocks, who's a young designer guy that works with Ryan, has been doing some amazing stuff with this. It's really, really, really good. And I just love the way that, from a layout point of view, we're not really limited by the confines of the visual horizontal or vertical grid structure. He's actually doing things which are much more lively in terms of elements that break out of the box. So I love this kind of stuff. And then just really, really simple. I mean, this was done by CUDA Partners, and I don't know, they've got a particular style, which you either like or you don't like, or it either works on a particular site or it doesn't. I mean, if you compare this with Coodle.com, there's a lot of very similar stuff going on. And you might even think that it's kind of got a hint of a list apart about it as well. But I think that's really down to the fact that they're using a lot of system fonts and twisting them in different ways to do good typography. And we're going to talk about typography a lot this afternoon, actually, because that's something that I think we can really improve on. So there is a hell of a lot of good stuff going on. If you follow galleries, I don't know, does anybody ever look at CSS Vault anymore? I don't think I ever have for a long, long time. But things like Style Gallery. I think there was even a CSS gallery that aggregated all the other CSS galleries, and at that point I thought, maybe enough's enough. Certainly Cameron Adams, I don't think he's here, but he's around the conference. Him, Andy Budd, and I did the Web Standards Awards for a little while, and that was very much a kind of designers for designers site, rather than just a CSS catalogue where you could kind of flick through it like Argos. Do you get Argos in Australia? No. It's like one of these crappy kind of home furnishing catalogues where you have to put it all together and it falls apart a week later. But this was very much a site where, although the sites that we featured were user submitted, they were then kind of reviewed and critiqued by me or Cameron or Andy or John Oxton for a time. And it was quite a fun site to do. But this closed just before Web Directions last year. And I use this quote a lot, actually, because when Cam wrote that we've arrived at a situation where beautiful sites with beautiful code are being produced by the hundreds every month, every week, every day, it's no longer a myth that you can produce a stunning site with web standards. Well, is that for me? Cameron's absolutely right, but I do feel that kind of in with what he's saying is the fact that there's very little left to talk about when it comes to CSS, and that I completely disagree with. I mean, yes, we're seeing a lot of CSS driven sites out there, but that doesn't mean to say that the CSS that's in them is any good. And there's a lot of sites that will use much more meaningful markup, but that doesn't mean to say that the markup's any good. And quite often we find that people that are moving to standards-based ways of working simply just replace table cells with divs. And I think there's an awful lot left to talk about in terms of actually really using these things to their best possible advantage, and hopefully that's some of the stuff we're going to talk about later on today. Because I think there's still an enormous amount of work still to do, and there's an enormous amount of potential there in terms of the design work that we can do. And if you just think about sites that are not inside of the kind of web standards-y world, I mean, this is for the, I don't know what this movie's like actually, is it out yet? This is the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
We're usually a few years behind the rest of the world.
Yeah?
They're not putting it out till next year.
I haven't seen this yet. But it hasn't got Donald Sutherland in it, so I'm not going to be. Even Nicole Kidman can't tempt me. But if you think about the amount of money that's spent by the movie industry on sites like this, and how visually rich they can be, and you think about the range of content that these sites provide. I mean, you've got everything from video through to goodies and stuff that you can download, and whether it's ringtones or wallpapers for cell phones or whatever it happens to be. This enormous amount of stuff going on, in a multi-billion-dollar industry. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any site from the movie industry, really, that was made with HTML and CSS in the right way. So, there's a lot of work still to do. What I love about these sites is just how visually fantastic they are, but there's absolutely no reason why even a page which is essentially one great big image cannot be marked up using semantic and accessible markup. Here we go. As we're in Australia, we can't not have Kylie. Actually, if you look at this, I mean, yeah, there's Flash going on and there's animation going on, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing to say that we can't mix a whole bunch of different technologies together, because, at the end of the day, these things are tools, and if they're there, we should use them. But if you actually look at something like this, okay, some of the animation effects may be a little trickier, and you wouldn't want to reproduce them with CSS or JavaScript. But is there anything really on that page that you couldn't mark up and do with CSS? Probably not. And then this is Nike. It's actually a little QuickTime movie of navigating the Nike homepage. And again, you've got this amazing, rich combination of different technologies. But actually, when you look at it and you think about each individual element on that page, is there any reason why we can't be marking this up using semantic markup and using CSS to style it? even with the video components, etc., that are going on. I don't think there's any real reason. So I think there's an enormous amount of work to do, and if we think about the work that we're doing within the kind of standards-aware community, if you want to call it that, and compare that in scale to what's been going on movie sites or music sites or big brands or sports, what we're doing is a tiny, tiny proportion. And then if you think about the darlings of the Web 2.0 world and delve underneath the markup for those kind of sites, I mean, if you look at actually how Flickr is structured, it's utterly, utterly appalling. And some of the guys at Yahoo in the UK have actually done whole presentations about how bad Flickr is. And kept their jobs, amazingly. So I think there's still an awful long way to go, and I think one of the things that we need to start doing as designers is taking the blinkers or the shackles off. What do you call it in Australia when horses in horse races? Are they blinkers here? Yeah, they call it something different in the States. We need to kind of take those blinkers off and think, well, there's an amazing kind of world of opportunity out there. That as a designer, I want to try to do the best possible work that I can and the coolest possible work that I can, and try to find ways in which we can get over this notion that we're limited in some way in terms of what we can do. So that was really the focus of this, really, because when I sat and did this for like 10 months last year, I didn't want to do another CSS cookbook. That really wasn't my intention. I wanted to do something which was much more about, there was some kind of philosophical stuff in there, and there's a little bit of kind of drum banging, but really trying to find ways in which, practical ways in which, hopefully designers can move forward a little bit and release themselves from some of the limitations that we kind of think of ourselves, these boxes that we bind ourselves by. So there were 5-ish kind of themes that ran through this. And maybe you'll recognize a little bit of some of these limitations as we go through. But I think the biggest thing that I came to realize was, in terms of the limitation, was that often we just think that as we're looking at something on screen, or our customers are looking at something on screen, that somehow it has to look the same on every browser or on every platform or on every screen. And this, I think, was one of the biggest limitations that we've had, or we thought we've had over recent years, is that, I've got to have it looking the same in Safari as it does in IE 5.5 or maybe IE 6. And that's been a real problem in terms of moving forward. The other thing which has been limiting is that, I'm sure, I'm going to talk about this a little bit at the conference as well, but we've had some more advanced CSS stuff, more advanced CSS selectors for a little while now. I mean, most if not all of CSS 2.1 has been adopted by browsers, and even some CSS techniques or selectors from CSS 3 are in certain browsers. Now, it all varies according to which browser you're using. Morning. But we've always shied away from using some of these things because it's like, okay, well, that's not supported by an IE6, so therefore I can't use it. And again, it comes back to this strange, archaic notion, I think, that everything has to look the same in all browsers, as if it was a piece of printed paper. So I think one of the things that I want to do, and certainly one of the things we're going to do a lot today, is to use as many of these CSS selectors that we might have thought or been termed advanced selectors in the past as we can, and use them intelligently in terms of saying, well, if this isn't supported by X browser, then what's my fallback how are things going to work, but not be limiting ourselves to what we can and can't use. There's two things that you're not going to hear today, by the way. One is hacks. We're not going to talk about hacks at all for the entire day. There won't be any mention of them at all. And then the other thing that we're not going to talk about at all anymore is IE6. So no IE6 fixes. All of the examples and stuff that we're going to talk about are all there for well-behaved browsers. And actually, all the example stuff is going to be available, as well as the slides. All of the example files are up online as well. So I'll give you the URL of those and let you figure out your own IE6 fixes for them. And that kind of leads on to CSS3. I mean, hello. Everybody complains about the fact that CSS3 is taking such a fucking long time. And, you know, why can't we have it? And what the bloody hell are the W3C playing at? You know, when CSS3's been in development for God knows how many years. And yeah, those criticisms are absolutely justified. But at the same time, one of the problems with developing the specs, and this is something I've learnt being on the CSS working group, is that it's all very well coming up with a specification, but actually finding out in practice how people use it and what the cause and effects are, you know, what the potential side effects of certain new selectors, etc., are, is, you know, virtually impossible to predict. And I get a bit frustrated in the fact that everybody complains about the fact that we need CSS3 and multi-columns and all this kind of stuff, and why is it taking so long? And yet, for the most part, 95% of the time, I would say, designers don't use what we have got. I mean, the fact that certain selectors have been available for quite some considerable time, and the fact that multi-column support is in Firefox to a degree. Nobody uses it. Well, we can't complain about stuff that isn't here if we ain't using the stuff that we already have got. And it really gets on my goat. So one of the things that I want to try to encourage people to do is to just use what's there as much as possible. Because that's what will encourage the browser makers to actually move forward themselves. And then if there are things that don't work, if there are things that we absolutely have to have, but aren't supported perhaps by every browser that we want to target, you know, let's use some other tools. There's nothing wrong in using Flash, there's certainly nothing wrong in using JavaScript to actually plug some of the holes in CSS. And we're going to have a look at some multi-column stuff a little later on. But certainly that's a subset of CSS3 that's only supported in one form in Firefox. But okay, you know, let's emulate that behavior using JavaScript if we need multi-columns. And if JavaScript isn't turned on, so what? They just don't get multi-columns. You know, nothing wrong with that. And then the other thing which we're going to talk about, and I want people to, just going up and down, to think about really a lot more is how we actually work in terms of markup. And actually a lot of the morning session, we're going to talk about markup in quite a bit of detail, actually. Because a lot of times you think, yeah, I've got markup. You know, yeah, I've been doing markup for 5 years or so. But it never hurts, I think, to have a look at re-evaluating how potentially you use markup, particularly in the light of what we're seeing recently, which is a real refocusing back on markup when we start thinking about microformats. So how many people here use microformats on a regular basis? Wow. How many people have heard the term microformats? Why haven't you used them so far?
Find the opportunity.
Yeah? Okay. Sorry?
Use the calendar in that page.
Right, I see. So it's really just waiting for an opportunity to put stuff on. So out of those people that would really like to use microformats but haven't yet, how many of you have got contact information on your web pages? Yeah, okay. I'm saying nothing. All right. So let's have a look at some of these things. Is everybody cool with that? Does that seem like a a reasonable set of things? A few people nodding. Does anybody violently disagree with any of this shit?
I was wondering about your IE6. I mean, I'd like to be able to ignore IE6 too, but 90% of our audience are using IE6 still.
Yeah, I'm not talking about ignoring IE6. I think we have to take into account the fact that we want our content to be accessible to anybody using any platform and any device. So really, it's not a question of ignoring older browsers. I mean, IE6 is just one example. But really, it's about thinking about how you write or design for the different layers. We're going to talk about that in a little while. But certainly, I would never advocate, locking users out of a particular set of content. Whether or not they see the same design is a completely different matter. And a lot of this comes down to education. So we're going to talk about that now. Well, I would imagine everybody's familiar with the term progressive enhancement. It's a very kind of grand term. Actually, the first guy to talk about this was my old mate Dave Shea, who didn't call it progressive enhancement at all, but thought about it in terms of Mozilla, Opera, and Safari enhancement. And this was like way back in 2003. And Dave's original concept was that, let's design a page which works at a baseline. So for a baseline browser, in this particular case, IE, because at this point in time we had no idea that IE7 would be along at any point. And from that point then start adding little layers on top. And I like to think of this approach as like building you're not going to know what a trifle is in Australia, right? Trifle? Yeah. In America they have no fucking idea what that is. I have to like a layer cake. Bloody Americans. But trifles, and the whole idea behind Dave's approach was that, you build a trifle, and it would be, the same trifle for all browsers. This analogy is going to go really haywire in a minute. And then what we do on top is sprinkle on the hundreds and thousands, we call them, the little thing. Yeah, okay, great. This is just like England. I'm going to talk about mushy peas in a minute. And so his idea was basically we'll build something for a baseline, and then we'll sprinkle on hundreds and thousands on the top, and the hundreds and thousands are for the better browsers. So that was the original idea, and it's one that's kind of stuck with people for a lot. And then Steve Champion from the Web Standards Project was the first guy that was really he coined the phrase progressive enhancement, and his idea essentially was the same as Dave's, but we designed for least capable devices first, and then add on top, sprinkle on the hundreds and thousands to give more modern browsers mushy peas. And that's been the general principle, I think, hasn't it, since then, really. We've always thought, right, we need to design this thing, and this thing needs to work at a baseline exactly the same as, in IE6, as Safari, as Firefox, as Opera. And then if there are these extra little visual twists or extra visual goodies that we want to add on the top, then okay, better browsers get those. But no harm for those old-fashioned, on-a-diet browsers that can't have mushy peas. But actually, I think that this is completely the wrong way to go about it. Because if we do that, we're always looking backwards in terms of the baseline. I mean, I'm sure that if you work in big companies, a lot of companies will have a browser matrix. I know that the BBC do this, and their browser matrix is based on the most popular browser, or most used browser, because I'm sure it's bloody unpopular, which is IE6. The problem with that, though, is that if you have something which is crap as your baseline, then you're really limiting your potential for moving forward. So actually, in my mind, what we should be doing is we should be designing for the best. We should be looking forward and actually building something which the best browsers, the current crop of good browsers, showed our designs to the best possible advantage, and then thinking about what happens if. And we're already doing it. You know, we're already doing it with accessibility, I hope. We're already doing it with JavaScript, I hope, in that we're considering what happens when JavaScript's turned off. And if anybody's doing anything with accessible markup, you know, you're always thinking about your source order, or you're thinking about your skip links, or you're thinking about other kind of stuff that we think helps people with visual disabilities. So we're already doing this anyway, but we just don't do it visually. And there's a lot of things that we can do, I hope, to kind of move us away from this old-fashioned thinking, which, I don't know, I think it's limiting. So we can apply this progressive enhancement technique, or this more forward-thinking technique for all sorts of different things in terms of the components about how we're working. So obviously CSS, if we're talking about visual styling, JavaScript and DOM scripting. I'm constantly amazed. I do a lot of work for companies where, you know, they've got a back-end development team that's perhaps doing the programming and the JavaScript and stuff like that. So I'll be designing stuff up and explaining to the developers exactly how I want something to work. And it's like, yeah, great. You know, we can use JavaScript for that, or, you know, we can use Ajax for that. And they just don't think about what happens when Ajax or JavaScript is turned off. Does it degrade? You know, does one of those nice show hide kind of Technorati watch list things degrade to a simple unordered list? So whatever it is, whatever set of technologies we're doing, we ought to be thinking about what happens if, and that's really the whole approach. Let's not limit ourselves to people that maybe don't have it, but think about what happens if. And I think one of the, this is what certainly turned me onto this whole area, was, of course, the CSS Zen Garden. I mean, there's been a load of cool stuff on that. Some not so cool, because I did one at one point. But really interesting things going on. I mean, this was Mike Davidson's, and he was using a lot of fixed positioning and lots of transparent PNG work, and the fact that, you know, you can't really see it on here, but you've got this kind of hand-drawn or bamboo-drawn lines that go around the whole page. Of course, if you look at that in an old-fashioned browser, you're just not going to get those particular visual twists. But he's designing what he wanted the final result to be, and then just thinking about what happens if. And then this was Igor Klusis. I've forgotten the actual name of this now. But if you actually look at this in Internet Explorer, you'll get a completely different design, which is kind of taking it to the extremes. But it went to show that, you know, you can use CSS intelligently to target different browsers if in fact you wanted to. And this was the one that got it for me. This is the one where the light bulb went on, and I was like, oh my god. This was Sean Inman's This Is Serial. And it's this bit down here. It's just that bit there, which was the bit that said to me, oh my god. Because if you look at that in Safari or Firefox, you get this wonderful kind of CSS fly-out menu. But if you look at it in IE6, you'll just get an unordered list with all of the list of the designs. And it was like, whoa! All of a sudden, the light bulb went on. So that's what did it for me. And I mean, the Zen Garden itself has been, I think, very, very influential. Has anybody done a design for the Zen Garden? Had a go? Even kind of privately? I tell you, you ought to do it. I mean, I know it's kind of a bit old hat now. Well, don't tell Dave I said that, but I know it's kind of been around a little bit. But just as an exercise, whether or not you're designing or you're coding, just as an exercise, it's well worth spending a Saturday afternoon just having a play around with it. And then you can take it, you can take these principles a little stage further. This is my news site. And I wanted to really kind of push what I thought I could do with this particular site. So I'll show you how it's done later on, but we've got text that wraps around both sides of an image, which isn't something that you normally see. And lots of columns. And, yeah, I could have got everything working, essentially everything working in IE6 as well. But I just decided that IE6 would get a black and white version. And I'm not exactly a rich man, but I make my business out of designing for websites for people that pay me money. So you might think, well, it's a bit daring or a bit suicidal, depending on your point of view, if you've got potential clients coming to a site and they see black and white. But actually, I've had some really good response. It's like some guy said to me a couple of weeks ago, "Oh, it's really nice to see black and white on the web. We just don't see black and white." So, let me just look into your mind, "Oh, you're using IE6." He went, "Yeah, how did you know?" But, you can do it. I mean, and you can play games with it. And why not? We're supposed to be creative, aren't we? So why not put, little kind of Easter eggs in? Or, why not use things in the way, just to have a bit of fun? I don't know about anybody else, I love putting Easter eggs into websites. And I had this one client, it was for a Welsh, because I live in Wales, and we had this council, they were doing a children's information service site. And I hired a really nice illustrator, Holly, to do loads of kind of custom cartoons and characters for it. And anyway, about 2 weeks before launch, the client came back and they said, "Oh, the homepage, we'd like a little bit of movement." Oh, God, it's all fun. And she designed this wonderful kind of big graphic header, but they wanted it, "Oh, can we not have some movement in it?" Oh, God, here we go. So literally, I cut the top off. And this particular part of Wales is famous for red kites, birds. So, and the client said, "Yeah, it'd be great, it's famous for red kites. Why don't we have, wait for this, why don't we have a red kite flying across the screen?" I was like, oh, God, okay. But at this point in the game, I just wanted to finish the job and get paid. So, she got what she wanted. So every kind of minute and a half, this red kite with like 3-frame animation just kind of moved across the page. And actually, the site's not live now, but the best thing about it was that if you moved your mouse over the bird as it was flying across the screen and double-clicked, the bird exploded. She never knew. You could shoot the bird. There used to be, I redesigned the Disney store a few years ago. And if you typed in a certain, I've forgotten what it was now, but if you typed in a certain word into the search box and pressed the go button, there was a bit of XSLT stuff going on in the back end, and it showed all of the developers wearing Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs hats. Why not? So we can do a lot of this kind of stuff. And we needn't be thinking that now, at least. It was more difficult a year ago. But now we've got much more of an opportunity to start to develop and start to do a lot more cool stuff. And a lot of it has, strangely, got to do with Internet Explorer. And, I'm very grateful for all the work that they did. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's a damn sight better than it was before. Yes, it's added, another layer of testing. They didn't fix everything. But, at least we've got a mainstream browser that has a decent stab at doing CSS rendering for a change. They've still got some DOM stuff to do, which Aaron Gustafson might say something about because he's been working on IE8. But, it's at least we have something now which is a damn sight better than it was before. And it's much easier to explain to clients in particular or managers now that there are different browsers. The fact that they've had to upgrade between 6 and 7 You know, that makes the discussion about the fact that there is more to the internet than just clicking the blue E. Makes that a lot easier. And I was convinced when my old blog did this, because this was, on the left was how every other browser rendered it. And on the right was my old kind of two-tone black and white IE6 version. And this blog ran for a couple of years, but when IE7 managed to render it within a NADS whatever of the other browsers, I knew that we were kind of ready. And I'm very grateful. I think that we all should be actually appreciative of what people like Chris Wilson did, because you know he was really kind of swimming upstream when it came to standard support, and he's been banging on about standards since he worked on Mosaic all those years ago. So finally we have something which is, you know, progressive. And then I get asked a lot, or the comment kind of comes back to me a lot. Well, it's all very well, you know, you, Clarky, talking about doing progressive stuff and designing something different for IE6 and giving them maybe less of an experience than more standards aware browsers. But actually this is something which is not just going on in my world, where I ride around on a big chair. And anyway, you know, you've got organizations like Yahoo that are putting their money where their mouth is and actually publishing stuff like this. I mean, this is the graded browser support. There was an article by Nate Keckley. Is everybody familiar with this so far? Yeah. Whereas really what Nate did was he came up with the idea that he would formalize their browser matrix, but they would have different grades of browsers, and each grade of browser would have a different level of support, all the way down to just seeing plain text, so building up and up and up. At the heart of what he said was that support does not mean that everybody gets the same thing, which is really where we've been, isn't it, for like the last 5 odd years. Expecting two users using two different browser software to have an identical experience fails to embrace or acknowledge the, this is a great word, heterogeneous essence of the web. I'm not quite sure what that word means. It's very impressive. But there you go. You know, now you've got organizations like Yahoo saying we're not going to expect that our designers or our coders have to produce something which looks exactly the same across all browsers. And really, I think this is incredibly forward-thinking, because it really goes to the heart of what we're going to talk about for the majority of today, which is that it's not just about different browsers. It's not just about Safari or Firefox or Internet Explorer, but it also goes to other forms of technologies as well, or other forms of devices that we're going to use in the future or even now to access web content. So do you expect that somebody using an iPhone is going to get the same experience as somebody using IE5 on a desktop PC? You just wouldn't ever imagine that they would get exactly the same. So it's this letting go of the notion that everything has to be exactly the same. And that there are different levels, there are different versions or different quality levels of browsers that I find really fascinating that Yahoo are standing up and doing this. But the problem is, 9 times out of 10, is that you hear back the comment, yeah, but my client uses IE6. Or, yeah, well, you can't convince the client. He expects everything to look the same across all browsers. And, you know, you do get that a lot, actually. Now, it's not our job to educate people, I don't think. You know, they're paying us to build websites. So our role is not really an education role. But there are some simple things that I do, and maybe you can do, just some simple examples that just make it really plain and easy for people to understand that not everybody's going to get exactly the same thing. I mean, this, you know, TV. Have we got HD TV in Australia yet?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because we've only, well, last couple of years in England. But, you know, I've got a 24-inch Sony CRT thing that's about this deep, non-HD TV. Now, I don't expect to get HD TV on my old TV. I expect to be able to watch the football and EastEnders or something, but I don't expect that I'm going to get it in super quality because I understand that I have to upgrade. And we've got this, the analog turn-off in the UK. I mean, it's a few years away yet, but they're actually going to stop analog broadcasting altogether. So everybody has to go digital, either whether it's cable or satellite or whatever. Freeview, they do it through an aerial. And this is really helping people, I think, to understand that, you know, well, yeah, if I need to get a better television service or a better quality of TV, or I want to see Blu-ray or whatever, then, you know, I'm going to have to upgrade my hardware. And people upgrade their hardware all the time. I mean, if I'd have bought, in fact, I did buy an iPod Nano a little while ago. I wouldn't now expect, I might feel cross that they released one quite so quickly, but I wouldn't expect to get video on my old Nano. You know, consumers in the real world that go out to a hardware store expect that stuff changes. And particularly within electronics, which is quite a good analogy when it comes to kind of web stuff. People expect that they're going to get a different experience with a different product. I mean, cell phones. I hardly use one, but I know that there's like 3 gathering dust in my house. It's funny, the last one, I bought a SIM card on Pitt Street to use here so I can have an Aussie phone number. And the girl in the Vodafone shop said, "Can I just see your phone, just to make sure that it's compatible?" So I gave her my cell phone and she laughed. And she said, "I haven't seen one of these since 1999. It's like, oh crap. But I know that it hasn't got Bluetooth on it, and I know it hasn't got a camera in it, and I just don't expect that it does all the cool stuff that my new iPhone is going to do. People expect to upgrade their hardware. And, you know, they expect to upgrade their software as well. And, you know, particularly when our lovely friends at Microsoft make things so complicated. And, you know, I couldn't fit all of the editions of Vista on the screen. Kind of would have gone out here somewhere. But, you know, what a nightmare. And if people can accept that they have to upgrade one buggy, bloated piece of operating system for a hugely buggy and bloated operating system, then surely they can accept, they're not unintelligent, surely they can accept that, you know, different web browsers do different things and show different things. It's all a matter of perception. And I think that there are ways in which we can encourage people, whether it's, you know, business managers or clients, etc., and just explain to them in simple terms why we're doing what we're doing. And I actually write it into the contracts that we have in terms of the company. I will actually write it in what browsers we write to and what we don't. And they sign off on that. So the way that we work is we'll say, right, we are actually going to code to today's most recent version of any browser. So IE7, Firefox 2, not 1.5, or Safari 2 as it stands at the moment. And if you want us to write CSS to make it look the same in IE6, etc., then we'll charge that at an hourly rate. And that's extra. So, you know, clients sign contracts with that in mind. And it works. So it's not going to be the same with everybody's situation, but it can work. And I think it's something that I'd certainly like to see a lot more people doing, is just stretching the boundaries of what's possible, rather than thinking, okay, well, I'll wait until the next something. Because it's like, you know, if I'd have waited till this Nano before I bought a Nano, you know, I probably wouldn't have bought this one. Because I'd still be thinking, well, there'll be another one in a few months' time that will have like more storage capacity, and you end up never owning a nano. So, you know, technology moves at a fairly swift pace, and I think we should as well. So, does anybody have anything to say? Gentleman over there.
How aware are your clients of the implications of those supporting the most modern browser?
Most of them are pretty savvy. I think you can't just make an arbitrary statement. I mean, one of the things that I do also do, where possible, where they have them, is to look at existing stats. And you'd be surprised at how many clients don't have any idea about stats at all. And I've actually taken to, generally speaking, one of the things that I will ask within a request for proposal document is, do you have stats? And if it comes back that no, they don't, even a month or two before we start the job, we'll stick Google Analytics on there, just to be able to see. And if it looks like there's a huge portion of their audience that's using a particular browser, then yeah, we have to take that into account. But that's still done at an hourly rate, because if they turn around and just put yourself in that position, if you found that 95% of a client's audience was using Netscape 4, you'd have to code for that. But why should it be up to you to absorb that cost within your quote, or your time if you're working for a company? It ought to be something which, if they have a specific requirement, that they should pay for. Anybody else? So are we are you agreeing with me on this, or not? Be honest.
Just to clarify, you tested in IE6, could you build for IE7? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we'll test it to make sure that the layout isn't broken, but we'll see a lot of examples as we go through the day. But yeah, essentially what we're saying is that they may not get the visual niceties. It might be, for example, we'll see an example of this later on, but just imagine that you're using, there's Gary's email address is on a particular page, and next to Gary's email address happens to be a transparent PNG of a telephone, of an email icon. I don't know, if you're using IE6 and you choose that you don't want Gary's particular email address to have that little email icon next to it, then IE6 won't get it, but it doesn't look broken. And the other thing which I think is interesting is that when you actually speak to people, it's only web geeks that have more than one browser or use more than one browser. How many clients have you ever dealt with that use, they don't sit there with IE6 and Firefox side by side, do they? It's only us, sad bastards, that have to do that. So
those using IE6 then, big deal. Big deal, they don't see it.
They
They're
d-
really gonna sit in another
exactly. I mean, a few years ago, I made...
They do. They do. Because when they upgrade, they go, wow, look at all these new things I've discovered.
Exactly. Well, this happened with a job that I did for WWF a couple of years ago, where I used a whole bunch of transparent PNGs. So there was like this whole kind of cloud designy thing going on, where there was a transparent PNG on the HTML element, and one on the body, and one on the container that surrounded all the content. And as you move the browser, resize the browser window around, you got this nice kind of layered effect. But of course in IE6, you just got the JPEG, flat JPEG, and that was that. And they went, oh, that's lovely. And then, as soon as they discovered that there were more browsers in the world, I think WWF in London said, okay, everybody has to use Firefox now. And they discovered that this particular site had this other stuff going on. It's like, when did you do that? That'll be another 500 quid, please. So, anybody else got anything to say?
It's almost too good to be true. I'm glad that it goes to developers for A6. It's become like such a natural part of I think a lot of people's development cycle. Waste hours and hours messing around with stupid crap in A6.
And that's the problem. That really is to the heart of the problem. Clients pay too much money for us to waste too much time. I mean, imagine that, I don't know, imagine your day rate is, I'm just going to make this up as well, imagine your day rate's $2,000 Australian a day. I'm just making it up, I've got no idea what the exchange rate is. But imagine it's $1,000 a day. What would your client rather you spent his $1,000 on? Working on the creative look and feel of the site and making it really polished, writing better content, or doing some fancy kind of Ajax-y thing that made the user interface more appealing, or fixing some creaky old shed of a browser. 9 times out of 10, give them the choice, and they'll say, do the cool stuff.
So is that depends on what the majority of the customers use?
Well, it does depend, but what I'm not saying is that you should ignore and just disrespect those users. What I'm saying is, and we'll see this as we go through, is that they just don't get the same, but they won't miss it. I mean, if somebody comes along with a lovely roast dinner and you don't have Brussels sprouts, there's no Brussels sprouts on the plate, you're not going to, well, you might miss Brussels sprouts, I do, but you're not going to know that they're missing. There's not going to be a kind of a hole where the sprouts go. There'll just be more carrots. You just won't miss it. They don't compare it with anything else. So yeah, I'm firmly of the belief that if we have, this is what it comes down to, if we have to do things which are either very time consuming or we have to add lots of presentational stuff into our markup to achieve a visual result, then if we have to really do stuff that we know is wrong to accommodate a browser and just to make it look the same across the whole range, then I personally think that that's the wrong thing to do. That's not to say that you make the content inaccessible. It's not to say that you make the design look crap or broken, because obviously you wouldn't want to do that. But it's just letting go of the idea that designs have to look exactly the same across every particular device, which as we get into more and more varied kind of access devices, makes a nonsense of the whole thing.
We tried to do that before, about a year and a half ago with a customer where we produced a design for the board, and when we actually produced the site to have different versions, obviously the board members had different versions of browsers, so they quickly picked up that one was different than the other, and so there was the whole sort of pushback in the contract.
Mm.
So, but the expectation there was it should be the same in every browser.
Mm.
Goes back to a print version, doesn't it? Because they expect pixel perfect, like you do in print, they can see it's all the same, looks the same.
And I did some work with Apple not so long ago, and the way that they work is that they have their design team, and their design team design pages, and Steve Jobs either approves them or not, and those are the designs, and then it goes to the engineering team and the code people, and they build it. And then they have a QA department where they will literally have, everybody's got 3 monitors, and literally it's page by page, pixel by pixel, getting things lined up. That's just how they work. To me, that's a very old-fashioned way of thinking about it. But the other thing, which is going slightly off topic, but the other thing about what goes on there, and maybe what goes on in the environment that you're talking about there, is that the fact that we design in Photoshop or in Fireworks, and that's the stuff that our clients see first and sign off. Well, if we're working in the web medium, then let's work in the web medium. And that's why I tend to do most of my design work and most of my client approval work now in markup and CSS. So that the client doesn't get a Photoshop comp and expect it to then look perfect in all browsers. Because at the end of the day, if you think about it, maybe the reason why we've got 1,000,000,001 fixed width centered layouts at 760 pixels is because the client signed off a fucking Photoshop comp. And that's what they signed off, that's what they expect to get. How on earth do you demonstrate to a client what's going to happen within a liquid layout if you're just working in Photoshop? So I would really advocate not working in Photoshop. I mean, a lot of the work that I've done recently, there's been one Photoshop comp. And it's really just been look and feel. Yeah, I might as well painted the damn thing with watercolors for all it matters. It just shows the look and feel, and then getting straight into the browser. That can really help. That's a really good technique, because then, you know, one guy sitting on one desk with one browser is going to see different things, and that's just what he expects. There's somebody at the back that wanted to say something. Gentlemen, all the way up there. Well, a certain company that I did some work for, who shall remain nameless, but when I was there, they had one of their smartest JavaScript developers I saw him spend 3 days writing a PNG fix script, just because they all just, you know, they use transparent PNGs all over the show. And 3 days worth of, you know, a senior developer's time to write a new PNG fix. Bad news.
Depends what sector you work in too. I mean, I work in a university and it is full of exactly the sort of dorks who are going, I looked at this in Firefox and then I looked at it in IE, and in Firefox it's aligned this way and in IE it's aligned, is this a bug?
But there are, what I would hope is that we can quite easily get past this, because, you know, people aren't stupid, and sometimes we well, maybe they are stupid. But they can be explained or reasoned with a lot of the time. And I remember doing a site for an engineering company, this was a couple of years ago. I don't know, they made some kind of measuring device that you stuck into something and it measured stuff. I don't know what it was. And I remember this guy saying to me, you know, we did one particular design, it was like, oh, that's, you know, far too flamboyant. You know, you've got to remember that, you know, our customers, it actually said to me, you've got to remember that our customers are the, you know, they're all engineers, you know, they just want to put it in and measure things. Which is probably true, except that I know for a fact that those same engineers would, you know, take off their long coats of a weekend and put on their corduroy trousers and sandals, and then trape miserably behind their wives on a Saturday afternoon while they were doing the shopping, you know, longingly looking in, you know, I don't know what you call it here, but, you know, like the electrical store window, you know, dreaming about all the gadgets. And, yeah, they're just like regular people, apart from the corduroys. But just because they do engineering for a job and they measure things with long sticks, doesn't mean to say that they don't kind of dream about gadgets, or, you know, why should this proby design be any different from a funky TV design? I don't know. Kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is the stuff that I want to talk about today. We're not going to think about IE6 hacks. In fact, we're not going to talk about hacks at all with any of this stuff. I think if you need to do remedial work on a site, then by all means do remedial work. But, you know, and how much you make things look the same depends on your time, your budget, the client requirements, and everything else. But the key thing is, don't limit yourself, I think. Don't limit yourself to the lowest common denominator. And that's kind of where we've been. And I'd like to start thinking about things a little differently. And it's not just about CSS either. I shouldn't have left that bloody Vista slide up there for quite so long, should I? Let's go back to that. Ah, lovely. It's not just about CSS and about design sometimes. it can also be about markup as well. How many people here write HTML or XHTML? Right, yeah, virtually everybody. What do the rest of you do? You're just here because it's warm, aren't you? A lot of the time, I think we still think about markup in an old-fashioned way as well. And one of the things that I actually get more comments about from this bloody thing than about the CSS is the kind of the markup section. And I think we've come a long way in terms of markup, and we are using a lot more semantic and meaningful markup than we were using, several years ago. But whether or not it's still good or good enough, I think is up for discussion. But anybody remember this guy, Dave Siegel? He wrote a series of books that you probably can still get somewhere. Designing Killer Websites. Yeah, he was the guy that popularized. He didn't invent this technique. Yeah, but he didn't invent this technique, but he was the guy that popularized the whole tables for layout, spacer GIF way that we all did. Maybe who here has never designed with or laid out page with tables? So we've all, we're all reformed tableaholics then. That's good. He was the guy that popularized the way that we worked on the web as designers for a long, long time. And he himself kind of came to regret, I think, tongue-in-cheek, the solution. But at the end of the day, there wasn't anything else that could be done at that point. Tables and spacer GIFs and font tags and all of those things that we sneer at other people for using now were the only way that we could get anything that looked half decent on the web. So we shouldn't really criticize Siegel or people that maybe even still work that way so much. But we have come a long way from that kind of fruitcake markup. And we're doing and we're using a lot more and thinking a lot more about the meaning of the markup that we're using and structuring pages a lot better, I hope. Somebody asked me what the HX element was before. That's like the super big heading. But, there's going to be nothing up there that that people haven't used before. Definition lists are often a little bit kind of obscure, and we can get into discussions about, whether or not we should use them for certain things that we use them for. But at the end of the day, we are using a lot more meaningful markup now than we would have done 5 years ago, and that can only be a good thing. We beat ourselves up about accessibility a lot of the time. But at the end of the day, by using, just by doing what we've been doing has improved accessibility for a whole bunch of people in ways that, we couldn't really have imagined. And it's also brought back into fashion some elements in HTML that, just got dusty. They would just lay in the bottom of the drawer, getting covered in fluff, and nobody actually ever used them. And I have to confess, I've never actually used a KBD element myself. But, it's there for marking up computer or programming-related code. So as well as doing the stuff that we know is important, headings and paragraphs and quotations, there are a whole bunch of these forgotten elements that we've kind of rediscovered. And just by doing that, again, we've made documents a lot more meaningful and a lot more accessible than they were before. And I think this is the key thing. In the past, we always thought about our markup from a presentational point of view. And we always thought about needing to structure HTML tables and spacer GIFs, etc., in order to produce a visual result. We've taken a step in the right direction a lot of the time when we're now doing CSS layouts, because the markup that we're using doesn't have tables for layout for the most part. But what I'm wondering a lot of the time is whether or not we've gone as far as we can go. This is CSS Naked Day from a couple of years ago. And this is great. This was Dustin Diaz came up with the idea where we should turn our CSS style sheets off for the day. And and that's what happened. So I took these screenshots kind of on the day. And it was great. I mean, a lot of people thought the web was broken. It was really hard to read blogs. And for good reason, actually, because it really exposed the fact that people structured their HTML on their documents in completely different ways. So, there'd be different heading levels. Some people would use the H1 for the logo, some people would use it for the title of the post. Some people would have all their navigation up front and then the main copy. Lots and lots of different ways in which these pages were structured. Everybody was hopefully using semantic HTML. But how it was used and the way that it was structured was really interesting. I actually had to edit this for the book. Where it said another big pair of tits, there was a picture of George Bush and Tony Blair. And the publisher made me take that out. John Howard? Oh, he was. So, it was interesting. Did anybody participate in this? Or see this? Did you do this, Gary? And for me, what this did was to illustrate quite graphically that it's all very well to think about using meaningful markup, but how you structure it and how you think about combining the elements together that go into making up a document is incredibly important. And one of the things that I realized was that 9 times out of 10, we're still potentially not producing the most semantic or meaningfully or well-structured documents that we could do. And this just highlights, the very different approaches that people take. And I began to realize that we were still approaching markup from a presentational point of view. Even though we weren't using tables for layout or spacer GIFs or whatever, we were still thinking about the elements that we use and particularly the order of the elements that we use on a page presentationally. So, I'll give you an example. This is something that we're actually going to build this page a bit later on. This is one of the examples. All of the examples are from a fictitious ska band that I made up. It's got my mates in it. So look at this page, and we have what? 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. So how many divs do I need to make that layout? Sorry?
Depends what you want to do with it.
Well, if I wanted to, if Gary had designed that in Photoshop and then I had to build it, how many divs would I use to create that 4-column layout, would you say? Gary? Yeah, you could say 4, couldn't you, as an average? Whether or not you have a containing one or whatever. You could do it. You could say 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is the answer that I usually get, because it's a 4-column layout. So, you might have, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because we look at it and we think, okay, I've got 4 columns, I need 4 divs. I would have used tables, but they're evil now, so not allowed to use those. I'm going to use divs instead, and that's what you do. And all well and good, but what happens if you didn't have to use any? that would actually be even cooler. Because if you think about what this actually is, and think about the essence of what that content is, and you go, oh shit, it's a list of band members. So if it's a list of band members, it must be an unordered list. Well, I'm going for one here because it's my markup. But you could say it's an unordered list. It's a list of band members, and every band member is a list item. That's what we see, isn't it? So that's what we get. It's an unordered list that covers the whole thing. Each band member is a list item, and inside each list item is the content that relates to that particular band member. So their name, their description, an image, and yeah, I've got a div in there, which is the micro format for their contact information. We'll come on to that in a minute. But essentially, that's it. I don't need to think about structuring the order of my markup or the type of elements that I use based on the visual layout. Because if I do that, I'm tying my design, I'm tying what I'm making into an on-screen, browser-based piece of work. Whereas actually, if you think about things from the content out, what we tend to do is we tend to look at a design and we think, right, okay, well, I need a div for this because it's the heading part, and then I've got a div for the sidebar, and a div for the main content, and then the footer. And we're just thinking about translating that visual structure into markup structure. And 9 times out of 10, we're just replacing table cells with divs.
It comes back to translating the grid onto the page. Yes.
It does. It comes back to thinking about that grid. But we think about what we're doing is we're applying that grid, we're applying that presentational thinking to the markup stage. And really, if we think about just, instead of working from the outside in, my shirt done it. If we think about instead of working from the outside in and thinking about the visual layout from the superstructure all the way into the individual elements, if we actually think about it from the other way, if you think about it from the content, absolute essence of what something is, in this case an unordered list, and then start building outwards, what you'll find is that your markup is incredibly reduced. The amount of actual divs or structural elements that you need to make up a design are reduced dramatically. But as well as making your markup leaner, what it does is it just increases your options. Because what we should be doing, what we're going to do today with a lot of these examples, is we're going to try to turn very little in terms of markup into quite a lot. So for example, with this particular example here, we can create that pretty complicated layout from just one unordered list. So our job, I think, is to think really detailed about the markup itself and about the content of what exactly each element of content is, and then work on that from the inside out, maybe rather than what we've been doing before, which is from the outside in. So has anybody got anything to comment on? No? Okay. Do you get what I mean about this whole kind of thinking about things presentationally, though, still?
I would see a difficulty in that this is a fairly specific predefined design, and for a project, for example, one that I work on consistently, it's constantly evolving, and the types of pages and the content change all the time, requiring completely different layouts, even after the initial site design redesign was done a year back. So a sort of strategy such as this may work in some examples in one website and on other areas of that same website.
I agree, but I disagree to a certain extent. I mean, yes, you've got to be making sure that the content is going to be displayable You know, if the content changes, you don't want the layout to be breaking, for example, which I think is maybe what you're getting at. If they pile in a load more content, then...
Well, a lot of completely different type of content. You get maps and stuff, you've got text on its own, you've got streaming media, all sorts of stuff, and not all on the same page. You've got a consistent layout.
In fact, talk about consistent layout is what I'm going to talk about at the workshop on at the conference on Thursday. Different ways of thinking about that. But I think, in essence, hello. I think I still go back. Whether or not we're delivering, particularly when we're delivering new and fresh content the whole time, we need to be thinking about exactly what that content is, and don't think about, my main point is don't think about the design first. Think about what the actual content is, and then use CSS to translate that content into the visual effect that we want to achieve. And if at that point you do need to add additional elements to achieve a visual result, then think about adding them at that stage, and think about adding them one at a time, outwards from that particular element. And also it makes bug fixing a hell of a lot easier as well. The less you have in a document, the less likelihood of something going wrong. So we got, what time is it now? 10:30. So we've got, I think we'll stop it here. Take a break. Is it break time? 5 minutes. So what we'll do is we'll come back to this a little bit later on. But this was my inspiration panel for the site that we're going to use for the example. So I kind of raided my scrapbook from about 1978. So we've got a half an hour break. So if we can be back here on the dot. I'm going to be going down the escalators and outside for a